You know that smell when a server room has not been dusted since the late 90s? It smells like ozone, burnt plastic, and the accumulated desperation of 1,000 unanswered help desk tickets. That has been my daily environment for 15 years. My name is Gerald, and I am a 58-year-old senior systems administrator. I am the person who makes sure your email works, so you can send passive-aggressive notes to Abigail in accounting about her yogurt consumption. I am the one who crawls under your desk to plug in the Ethernet cable you kicked out while daydreaming about early retirement. I am the invisible backbone of Apex Logistics, which is a mid-sized shipping software company that handles millions of routes across the country. And usually, I like it that way. Invisibility is a superpower. It means nobody notices when you are watching. But 3 months ago, the invisibility started to feel less like a superpower and more like a burial shroud. I was sitting in my office, which was a converted storage closet that hummed loud enough to vibrate my dental fillings loose, staring at a budget denial email. The email was from Bradley, our new human resources director. Bradley is the kind of guy who uses words like synergy and drill down unironically while wearing a suit that costs more than my car. The email said in no uncertain terms that my request for a basic firewall upgrade, a critical security patch that stood between our sensitive data and every hacker in Eastern Europe, was denied due to budgetary constraints. Under the guidelines of the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, our current setup was practically begging for a massive breach. But corporate did not seem to care. Budgetary constraints is corporate speak for spending money on useless things. 10 minutes after I read that email, I looked out the narrow window. My office might be a closet, but it has a sliver of a view of the executive parking lot. And there it was, a brand new slate gray Porsche Cayenne. It was glistening in the sun like a wet seal. It still had the temporary dealer tags. Stepping out of it was the chief executive officer's wife, Eleanor, a woman whose primary contribution to society seemed to be posting inspirational quotes on social media. I watched her walk into the building, bypassing security, because the rules do not apply to the executive family. I knew for a fact that the chief executive officer, Lawrence, had been crying poverty in every town hall meeting for the last 2 quarters. He would look somber while checking his luxury watch and telling us that we all had to make sacrifices. Apparently, his sacrifice was settling for the leather interior instead of the suede. The company was planning layoffs, and they were already violating the spirit of the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, commonly known as the WARN Act, which required a 60-day advance notice for mass layoffs. Yet, Lawrence had money for a new luxury SUV. I took a hit from my vape pen that looks like a USB drive. When the rage gets too high, I take a hit right there in the server room, and the industrial fans suck the evidence away instantly. I pulled up the procurement logs. We in information technology see everything. We are the digital janitors. When the company buys a laptop, I see the invoice. When they subscribe to software, I approve the license. And when someone tries to hide a luxury vehicle purchase in the company ledger, they better hope the person reviewing the codes is an idiot. I am not an idiot. I scrolled through the back-end expenses for the month. It did not take long. There it was, buried under a generic vendor code, usually reserved for heavy hardware maintenance. The vendor name was listed as Stuttgart Logistics. The amount was exactly $118,000. I almost laughed. It was so lazy, they listed a Porsche Cayenne as a server rack expansion. I guess in Lawrence's mind, the car had 4 wheels and a computer in the dashboard, so that made it information technology infrastructure. My blood started to boil. Not the hot, flashy anger of a teenager, but the slow, thick rage of a 58-year-old man who has followed the rules his entire life, only to get stepped on by executives and expensive loafers. I looked at my screen at the denied firewall request. We were running on security protocols from 2018. If a teenager in a basement decided to ping our network, we would fold like a cheap lawn chair. But Lawrence's wife needed heated seats. I reached into my desk drawer. Underneath a pile of tangled cables and empty ibuprofen bottles, I kept a physical notebook. It was a tattered red spiral-bound college-ruled notebook. I did not keep this data in a digital file. Digital files can be wiped, corrupted, or locked by administrators, but a physical notebook is forever. That is analog vengeance. I opened it to a blank page. I had been keeping this log for years, tracking minor discrepancies, like business lunches that were clearly personal dates and office supplies that were actually video game consoles. But this was the whale. I wrote the date, the time, the invoice number, and then I wrote asset tag 00459. Porsche Cayenne, allocation server maintenance, user Eleanor, does not appear to improve network latency. I closed the book. The red cover was tattered, but it was the most dangerous object in the building. I did not know it yet, but the fuse had been lit. The rest of the week was a blur of petty indignities. Bradley, the human resources wonder boy, started hovering around my department. He was looking for inefficiencies. He asked me why I needed 3 monitors. He asked why my team's overtime was so high. I wanted to scream that the system was held together by duct tape and prayers. I wanted to tell him that while he was optimizing synergy, I was manually rebooting the Exchange server at 3 in the morning so he could get his morning newsletter. But I did not say that. I just smiled the tight-lipped smile of a man, visualizing his manager's desk being thrown out the window. Bradley leaned against my doorframe, checking his reflection in the glass of the server rack, and told me that the board was looking for cuts. He asked if I was a team player. I looked at his $400 haircut and thought about the Porsche Cayenne. I told him I was very committed to the infrastructure of this company. Bradley tapped my desk and said the upcoming all-hands meeting would be a pivot point, and they were trimming the fat. I did not know I was the fat. I thought I was the muscle. But that is the mistake we all make. We think competence protects us. We think that if we just do our jobs well, if we keep the lights on and the data flowing, we are safe. We forget that to a leech, the host is just a resource to be drained until it collapses. I spent the weekend preparing not for a presentation, but for a war. I backed up my personal emails. I synced my special files to an encrypted cloud drive that the company firewall could not touch. I went through the red book and cross-referenced every entry with a printed copy of the invoice, which I kept in a fireproof box in the trunk of my old sedan. Paranoia, maybe, but just because you are paranoid does not mean they are not out to get you. Monday morning came with the heaviness of a funeral. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning in the main atrium. The air conditioning was broken again, which was another ticket I could not fulfill because we could not afford the parts. The room was stiflingly hot. It smelled of cheap cologne, nervous sweat, and the lukewarm pepperoni pizza they had ordered to boost morale. Nothing says we appreciate you like lukewarm pizza while we discuss layoffs. I stood in the back near the exit, always knowing my exit route. Lawrence was up on the stage wearing a suit that shimmered under the fluorescent lights. He was talking about market challenges and headwinds. He looked tanned, rested, and like a man who had spent the weekend driving a very fast car that was technically a server rack. Then Bradley took the microphone, and the atmosphere shifted. It went from boring corporate talk to something sharper and colder. Bradley scanned the room. His eyes landed on me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew I was about to become the prime target. Bradley started talking about cultural issues, insubordination, resistance to change, and legacy employees who think they own the place. He did not say my name yet, but his intentions were obvious. The crowd parted slightly, and people shifted away from me as if I were radioactive. I clutched my shoulder bag. The red book was inside, heavy against my hip. I took a deep breath. Bradley smiled and said we needed to talk about the information technology department. Specifically, he pointed out a refusal to adapt to modern budgeting strategies. My heart hammered against my ribs. I saw my team of junior technicians, 3 guys in their 20s whom I had trained from scratch, look down at their shoes. They were terrified. If the manager goes, the grunts are next. Lawrence stood behind Bradley, looking like a disappointed father. Bradley looked at me and said that they had discussed the firewall upgrades and the budget, and yet he was hearing reports that I had been bad-mouthing leadership, creating toxicity. I had not bad-mouthed anyone. I had stated facts, but in corporate land, stating a negative fact is an act of treason. Bradley announced that it was insubordination and incompetence, and effective immediately, they were terminating my employment. The room gasped. A collective sharp intake of breath. You do not fire a 15-year veteran in an all-hands meeting. You do it on a Friday afternoon quietly. This was a public execution to scare the rest of the employees. They wanted me to cry or shout to prove I was the difficult employee they claimed I was. My hands were shaking, so I put them in my pockets. I looked at Bradley, who looked triumphant. He told me to leave my badge at the front desk and that security would escort me out. Time slowed down. Adrenaline was dumping into my system. I saw the sweat bead on Lawrence's upper lip, and then I noticed a man in a gray suit standing near the water cooler. He was holding a clipboard, looking incredibly bored. I recognized the type. He was an external forensic accountant, likely brought in by the board to rubber stamp the layoffs. A calm washed over me. If I was going down, I was taking everyone with me. I stepped forward and said loud enough for everyone to hear that I wanted to show the auditor the real budget. Bradley tried to stop me, snapping that this was not a debate. The security guards, guys I had shared donuts with for years, took a hesitant step forward. I shot them a look, the look I used when they tried to bypass the web filter, and they froze. I kept walking, my shoes clicking on the floor. I reached into my bag and pulled out the tattered red book. It looked pathetic, but it was the diary of a man pushed too far. I stopped in front of the accountant. I asked him if he was the forensic auditor, and he nodded, saying his name was Mr. Adler. I told him I was being fired for managing the budget incorrectly, and I thought he should see the real ledger. Lawrence shouted from the stage that the book was company property and that I was unauthorized. I ignored him and handed the book to Mr. Adler. I told him it was a personal log with invoice numbers he could look up in the database. Mr. Adler took the book and opened it. Bradley was rushing down the stairs, looking flushed, screaming that this was harassment. I told Mr. Adler to start on page 42. The room was paralyzed, 80 people holding their breath. Mr. Adler flipped to the page, adjusted his glasses, and read the entry. He paused, squinted, and then looked up at Lawrence. His expression was no longer bored. It was confused and disgusted. Mr. Adler asked Lawrence why there was an entry cross-reference with a hardware invoice that listed a Porsche Cayenne under server maintenance. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. Bradley's face went the color of spoiled milk. Lawrence looked like he was trying to calculate how fast he could run to the nearest airport. Lawrence started to stammer, but Mr. Adler turned the page and asked why the off-site data storage facility address matched a luxury condominium in Aspen, Colorado. The silence grew heavy and suffocating as the entire room absorbed the revelation. Coworkers looked at each other, whispering in disbelief. The security guards looked at the stage, their faces filled with realization and quiet disgust. I smiled. It was the smile of a wolf, watching the sheep realize the gate was wide open. I told Mr. Adler I would leave him to it, and that I had to go pack my box. I turned around and walked out. The murmur behind me turned into a roar of chaos. I walked past the stunned receptionist, Clara, and out into the hallway. My hands were shaking with pure adrenaline. I made it to my closet office. I had about 10 minutes before they cut my digital access. I sat down at my desk, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I did not steal any data, as that would violate federal laws, but I ensured my personal backups were secure, and I sent one final command to the server. I had written a dead man's switch on the logging system. If anyone tried to delete the transaction history for the last 3 years, the system would archive it to a read-only partition and email a copy directly to the board of directors. My screen flickered and showed access denied. They were faster than I thought, or maybe they just pulled the plug. It did not matter. The seed was planted. The tattered red book was in Mr. Adler's hands, and he looked like a man who cared very much about where the decimals went. I grabbed my framed photo of my cat, my emergency snacks, and my coat, and walked out into the harsh sunlight. I lit a cigarette. I was unemployed and I was likely going to be sued, but for the first time in 15 years, I was not invisible. I sat in my old sedan watching the building. The all-hands meeting, which usually lasted an hour, ended 12 minutes after I left. The doors burst open, and employees streamed out, phones pressed to their ears. The pizza party was definitely over. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Justin, my junior technician. He wrote, "Oh my God, Gerald." Lawrence is screaming at the accountant, Bradley is literally crying, and they kicked everyone out of the room. What was in that book? I smiled and texted back, "Just the specifications, Justin." I put the car in gear and drove out of the parking lot, passing the slate gray Porsche. I slowed down, rolled down my window, and spat on the driver's side window. It was childish, but it healed a small part of my soul. I drove to the nearest dive bar. It was 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, and the place smelled of bleach. I ordered a whiskey sour. The bartender, Pete, did not even blink. He asked if it was a rough day. I told him it was the best day of my life because I had just fired my boss. Pete grunted and poured me another glass, giving me a silent nod of respect. I sat in the dim corner, sipping the cheap alcohol, knowing that my quiet 15 years of obedience were officially over. While I drank, I thought about the Red Book. Fraud always starts small. It starts with a team dinner with expensive wine, then a conference trip that is actually a vacation, and then they get brave. They get stupid. The Porsche was just the beginning. The cloud storage redundancy project was another favorite of mine. They billed the company $45,000 for off-site storage, but the address belonged to Bradley's mother in Florida. Unless she was running a mainframe next to her garden, that money was gone. Bradley had set up a fake corporate entity named Sunshine Cloud Services, and because he was the human resources director, the invoices were approved automatically without any review. I knew Mr. Adler would find that on page 56. My phone buzzed again with a text from Clara, the receptionist. She said security had locked down the executive wing and she could hear shredders running. I took a sip of my drink. Shredding paper is useless when the digital footprint is permanent, and the only person who knew the map of the network was currently sitting in a dive bar. I realized I had crossed a line. I was a whistleblower now, and whistleblowers do not get severance. They get lawsuits. I opened my personal laptop and connected to the bar's wireless network. I logged into my bank account, moved my savings to a different bank, changed my passwords, and locked down my social media. Then I saw a notification of a login attempt on my personal cloud storage. The source Internet Protocol address was 192.168.1.10, which was the executive subnet at the office. They were trying to guess my passwords. They tried standard company combinations, but I was prepared. I had a script set up, a honeypot folder labeled Evidence. If they clicked it, a script executed that locked their screen for 5 minutes and loudly played a comical tuba theme song. I watched the log, saw the script execute, and laughed. Somewhere in the office, Bradley or Lawrence was staring at a frozen screen with loud music playing, unable to turn it down. Pete, the bartender, asked why I was smiling, and I told him I was picturing a clown getting hit with a pie. But the smile faded because I knew the lawyers would be next. Lawrence was a cornered rat, and rats bite. I needed legal counsel, a real attorney. My phone rang with an unknown number. I picked it up. A smooth voice introduced himself as Randall, representing Lawrence's legal interests. He demanded the return of the company property, specifically the logbook, citing a confidentiality agreement I had signed in 2008. He threatened that under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, they would seek massive damages, including my home and pension, if I shared the book. Randall offered a 6-month severance package if I returned the book by 5 that afternoon. It was tempting, but I knew it was hush money. If I took it, they would win and they would sue me later anyway. I told Randall to shove his severance package and hung up. I blocked the number. I was shaking, but I lit another cigarette. I told the bartender to keep the tab open. I drove back to my apartment, which was a simple 2-bedroom place, but the second bedroom was my server room sanctuary. I sat in my ergonomic chair and connected to the backdoor Ghost account. The dashboard was lit up with red alerts. Bradley was frantically trying to delete directory paths, but Mr. Adler had already initiated a legal hold using the Ghost account. The system blocked every delete command. I watched Bradley try and fail repeatedly. Then the executive email started flying. I saw the subject lines about stopping the auditor and references to renovations. Page 62 of my book had an $80,000 office improvement charge for a 3rd floor, but our building only had 2 floors. Bradley had recently renovated his kitchen with expensive marble. The pieces were all falling into place. A few minutes later, I received an email from Mr. Adler on my personal account. The subject line read, "We need to talk." The body was brief, asking me to meet him at a diner on 4th Street in an hour and telling me to come alone. He mentioned that the discrepancies went far beyond the car, specifically pointing to page 88. I stared at the screen, knowing exactly what he had found. Page 88 detailed the consulting fees for 3 women who had been listed as user experience experts but had no professional history. I closed my laptop, grabbed my car keys, and headed out. The diner was a greasy spoon that smelled of old oil and weak coffee, the perfect place to hide. I saw Mr. Adler in a corner booth, looking completely out of place in his sharp suit. He had my red book open, his face pale as he stared at the pages. I sat down and he whispered that the numbers were terrifying, showing $15,000 a week being wired to shell companies. I told him flatly that they were paying for high-end escorts using the company credit card. Mr. Adler was shocked, realizing the scale of the corruption. He explained that if this became public, the stock would collapse and the board would face massive liability. He needed the digital logs to prove the wire transfers, but the executives were trying to wipe the database. I told him about the ghost account I had built years ago to patch servers from home. I gave him the username and the password formula, which involved reversing the company mission statement. He thanked me and warned me to stay safe, saying these executives had money and could hire dangerous lawyers. I told him I was ready for whatever they threw at me. That evening, Sandra, Lawrence's executive assistant, came to my apartment with a bottle of champagne and an envelope of her own. The champagne was a vintage bottle that Lawrence had left in the executive refrigerator, which she had quietly taken as part of her exit strategy. She sat on my sofa and explained that Lawrence was locked in his office, calling high-priced legal fixers to save his skin. She showed me receipts for Lawrence's luxury hotel stays and leases for his mistress's apartment, all paid with company funds. She wanted them to burn for how they had exploited the staff. We compiled the files together, combining her physical copies with my data. Then my computer chimed with an email from the board of directors. They offered to hire me as an external consultant for $250 an hour with a $20,000 retainer provided I signed a non-disclosure agreement. They wanted to buy my silence. I refused and replied, raising my rate to $500 an hour, demanding a $50,000 retainer, and flatly declining the non-disclosure agreement. I told them I would see them in the morning and bring donuts. The next morning, I wore a blazer and drove to the office. The gate guard, Dave, let me in when I reminded him I knew about his habit of watching movies on duty. I walked to the conference room where Mr. Adler had set up his war room. The tension in the office was high, with employees gathered in small groups, whispering about the imminent arrival of federal investigators. Mr. Adler told me the board had accepted my terms and granted me immunity. He also mentioned the chief financial officer had tried to flee on medical leave, but was stuck at the airport due to bad weather. I tracked the CFO's corporate phone using our mobile device management dashboard, confirming his location directly in the terminal departure lounge. Bradley walked in, looking disheveled, and demanded to know why a terminated employee was in the room. I pointed out page 62 and his fake invoice for an ergonomic workstation that was actually a hot tub. Bradley panicked and blurted out that Lawrence had expensed a luxury yacht as marine logistics research. Mr. Adler recorded the confession immediately. Bradley fled the room, heading straight toward the shredders, but it was too late. Mr. Adler called the federal authorities, noting that this had crossed into wire fraud and embezzlement under California Penal Code Section 470. Within minutes, the lobby was filled with federal agents wearing dark windbreakers. They presented a warrant signed by a federal judge, citing probable cause for wire fraud and money laundering. The agents marched into the executive suite. Within hours, FBI agents led Lawrence out in handcuffs. The office was stunned, watching their arrogant leader get carted away. 3 months later, I testified before the board of directors in New York. The mahogany table was massive, and the board members looked like vultures in expensive suits. The chairman pointed out a missing sum of $500,000 in cash that Lawrence claimed he could not recall. Lawrence sat at the end of the table, looking defeated, begging me with his eyes. I knew the cash was hush money for an illegitimate child, but revealing it would destroy his innocent family. I looked at Lawrence and told the board the cash was lost to gambling debts. It was a lie, but keeping the secret meant I would own Lawrence forever. The chairman sighed and added it to the civil suit. I left the boardroom, received my $50,000 check, and updated my professional status to senior forensic consultant. I was finally visible, and I was the storm. I drove home, sat on my couch, and opened a cold beer while watching television. My phone buzzed with a TikTok notification showing a video of a guy named Zach wearing a vintage military jacket, my dad's old jacket that Eleanor had accidentally donated to charity years ago. Zach was posing in front of a mirror, showing off the vintage patch on the shoulder. It was the exact flight jacket my father had worn in the service, a piece of my history that Eleanor had thrown away during her organizing phase. I smiled, opened my laptop, and started looking into Zach's profile. The war was over for the company, but I still had work to do. I was ready to trace every penny they had stolen and make sure justice was fully served. I sat back, took a deep breath, and prepared for my next corporate adventure, knowing that I held all the keys to their kingdom.